Um, yeah, I think, no, I know, when we talk about, as I'll say this, as a history student, a lot of times I see the ways in which history has been taught, has been sold to us as a sort of like, oh, well, it happened because of one person was the main driving force for this, or uh, these people achieved these rights because they were consistently doing like peaceful protests, or they were, towing the status quo line and sort of like following the mainstream ideals of society at that time, and just like slowly pushing people forward, slowly making demands. But no, really, what happens in every single instance of a call for revolution, a call for the end of a occupying force, the end of a systemic disparagement, has been the direct result of direct action, direct result of people who have seen the utility of disrupting society at different levels to call to attention the oppression that is being wrought upon marginalized nations. And we yeah, just through my studies, I've just noticed how invested the colonial powers, imperialist powers are in sort of like framing this what I like to call cultural tax on our movements, on our people, to sort of give the ideas that they are on the right side of history, that they are the ones that are being the civilized, quote unquote, this very charged word, side in this sort of in these exchanges. So with that, I think the next question you all touched on a little bit, but I'd like us to sort of speak more to this directly. So, what material ways are the colonial forces in the U.S. that have worked to oppress Black folks here linked to other areas of colonial occupation, such as in Palestine?
I can just start briefly and then I'll pass it off to some other folks. I have like so I feel like another panelist will speak to the deadly exchange, right? So the training of US police by Israeli occupation forces and what that means for us, especially knowing that police brutality is like an issue that impacts Black liberation movements, and historically the police have been used and that is their purpose, to repress and surveil our movements. But I also want to speak to like a more, I guess, local application of it that I feel like here in Texas will also probably be a little bit similar to. So in Florida right now, we're having our Florida legislative session, right, for the 2024-2025 year. Um, and right now we're seeing certain legislators who are proposing, like the same ones who supported the DEI bans, the same ones who supported banning Black history in school, are the ones who are now pushing forward legislation trying to make it so any Palestinian students and our supporters aren't able to access financial aid, right? Like that our aid now becomes requiring, or it's hinged on whether or not we support foreign terrorist organizations. Mind you, every single Palestinian political party is considered a terrorist organization. There is no way for us to interact with our people back home without us being called terrorists, because the designation of terrorists is just used by those in power to say we don't like the way these people are doing these things. So when we talk about like how these forces are linked, we see it in so many different levels. You can look at it at a city level. You can look at your police budgets and see where their pensions are invested in, and I bet you it's going to be invested in Israeli bonds. You can see it at a state level when Florida, for some reason, has opened a legislative session literally in occupied Palestine. Ron DeSantis opened legislative session, I think in 2020 or a few years ago, in occupied Palestine, standing in Al Quds. Like, so we see this very directly. The same man who's trying to ban everything. If you're a queer person existing in Florida, he's trying to get you out. If you're a Black person existing in Florida, he's trying to get you out. And if you're Palestinian in Florida, he's trying to get you out. And this is obviously a very hyper local focus of Florida and like the context we have coming in. But it's also true for across the US and elsewhere as well. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. Uh, you mentioned the deadly exchange. Just to talk a little bit more about that. That's one of the most dangerous places for us here. as Black Americans, where the state violence in the U.S. and in Israel come together. Where police, ICE, Border Patrol, and Israeli soldiers, police, border agents come together to share their, we share best practices. They share their worst practices. They share their worst practices, to extend and expand repressive policing here and in Palestine. So we see massive spying and surveillance, deportation and detention, imprisonment and attacks of our activists, racial profiling, and all of that. And you mentioned before, from the very beginning, the creation of the American police, they've been in the business of trying to snuff out our protest movements, especially the Black Liberation Movement. And in the recent decades, we've seen these increasingly militarized tactics. We had tanks on the street here in 2020, and that process of militarizing the police forces is rooted in imperialism, and it's rooted in America's war making all over the world. And that includes the funding and the support for Israel. So there's an exchange of not just technology, but also obviously there's a exchange of weapons and practices that the United States uses against Black and brown people here. So it comes back to our streets. The money lands in these arms corporations. The weapons and tactics land back on our streets. And I talked earlier about NARPR and why we focus on police repression and the fight for community control of the police, because we have to expose and end the police state to make the greater organizing space for Black liberation in the United States and liberation for all oppressed people.
Hey, go ahead. We love hearing from you.
So the way I thought about this question a little bit, it made me think about, the parallels, what we see that is, Palestinians being subject to and what we see Black and brown folks subject to here in the U.S. And they already brushed on it, like the deadly exchange is the prime example, right? But not just that, I think even the use of the carceral system, as a means of suppressing any forms of resistance. So just in the past few months, we've seen that the number of prisoners, of Palestinian prisoners in Zionist entity prisons has nearly doubled, right? And then we think back to what you mentioned, like the surveillance and the crackdowns on like the Black Panther movement in the 60s and 80s, right? So we see these parallels, we see the same tactics, the same methods to oppress us, right? Because it's linked to the same system. I even think to like settler violence in Palestine and the increase of settler violence and the history of white supremacist attacks on Black communities in the U.S. Just recently, we saw that a member of our community was stabbed in Austin, right? These things are all very much related, and they manifest in the same way in the U.S. and in Palestine. Another thing that comes to mind right now is just the history of medical experimentation that the U.S. has, subject Black people to, and we're seeing happen right now in Palestine, and it has been happening. I mean, just a few weeks ago, we heard about the bodies that were returned to their families in Gaza, and they came back without organs, right? So really, like when we think of material ways that this is manifesting, that colonial structures and imperial structures like manifest violence against our people, they're almost identical here and in Palestine and all places really impacted by Western imperialism.
I want to make a quick add to that because I think the point about settler violence is so important, and like what we would probably call here like white supremacist vigilante violence, like people who are not uniformed officers but believe that they can just go around killing people. So people like, from Florida, we had Jordan Davis, we had Trayvon Martin. Trayvon Martin is one of those names who we say in a room and most folks know who it is because it galvanized not just the Black liberation movement in the U.S., but it galvanized liberation movements all over the U.S. for different struggles because it was such an awakening moment. So with both Jordan Davis and Trayvon Martin, we saw white vigilantes be able to kill young black people. Trayvon Martin's case, George Zimmerman, to this day is free on the streets. To this day is free on the streets. Shame, a shame. Jordan Davis's killer is locked up because the only reason that happened is because the people demanded it. They would have done the same thing with Trayvon's. They would have done the same thing with Jordan's killer that they did with Trayvon's had that not happened. And I bring that up because we also see the murder of baby Wadia, a 6-year-old shot 26 times because of the abhorrent dehumanization of black and brown people and Palestinians that have led to that. And then we saw with the stabbing in Austin, we saw the attempted killing of the 3 young Palestinian men, Hisham, who I believe is now paralyzed. So there's so many different real like applications and real examples of how we're all subjugated by the same system, and we just have to open our eyes to it.